Carl Jung discovered that men who abstained from intimacy for 90 days experienced something so profound, so transformative, that it completely changed the way they perceived reality. They reported supernatural levels of focus and a magnetic presence that drew people in, along with creative breakthroughs that seemed to come from another dimension. But this is what Jung found most unsettling. Most men will never experience this because they're too afraid of what they might discover about themselves if they stopped running from their own minds. All ancient civilizations knew something we've forgotten. The Spartans before battle, the samurai during training, monks from every religion, even geniuses like Tesla and Newton, they all understood that your most powerful energy can either scatter you into 1,000 distractions or be concentrated into something that makes you nearly unstoppable. Carl Jung spent decades studying this phenomenon. He observed that certain men seemed to possess an almost otherworldly level of focus, creativity, and magnetic presence, while others wandered through life in a constant haze of mental noise and emotional chaos. What separated these two groups wasn't intelligence, background, or even talent. Jung discovered that the difference came down to one fundamental principle: how we direct our most primal energy. He found that when this energy is consciously redirected, instead of unconsciously scattered, it doesn't just change what you can achieve, it changes at the deepest level who you are. But here's what Jung found most fascinating. This transformation follows a predictable pattern, with specific stages and timings that he documented in hundreds of cases. The knowledge exists, the map is clear, yet most men will never access this power, because they're not willing to pay the price that every warrior, every genius, every spiritual master in history has paid. In this video, you're going to learn Jung's exact plan for redirecting this energy. I'll guide you through the 3 brutal phases every man faces, and why most give up before they ever reach true transformation. You'll discover what separates the men who tap into extraordinary focus and presence from those who stay trapped in cycles of distraction and mediocrity. By the end, you'll have the map. But whether you use it or not, that's entirely up to you. There's a change no one warns men about. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic announcement or a grand inner awakening. It arrives in silence. When the pursuit of sex suddenly stops, whether by choice, rejection, or exhaustion, peace isn't created. A void is, and that void is disorienting. A man might expect clarity or calm, but what arrives is a strange kind of weightlessness. Without the chase, without the flirty messages, without validation, without anticipation, time stretches, the days feel different, and in that moment, the rhythm that used to keep him moving begins to break. This is the first silence after years of noise, not external noise, but the hum of a constant, subtle, unspoken, omnipresent sexual orientation. It shaped his thoughts, his movements, even the way he dressed or entered a room. When it disappears, the machinery slows down, and that's when he notices the stillness. Jung spoke of libido as more than just sex. It is psychic energy, and when that energy is no longer expressed outward, the man begins to feel it building up with no clear place to go. But this is not yet transformation, it's just the threshold, a psychological pause. What happens next depends on what the man does with that silence. Most try to escape it. Few are brave enough to remain within it. When the sexual rhythm disappears, the 5th thing to fracture is not the body, it's the persona, the social self, the projected mask a man has worn for so long that he's forgotten it was ever a performance. For years, maybe decades, that mask was shaped by the desire to be attractive, to be wanted, to be chosen. Without that dynamic, the ego begins to collapse. This collapse doesn't look dramatic on the surface. There's no thunder, no visible breakdown. It's quieter than that. It's the sudden discomfort in your own clothes. The realization that the jokes you used to tell no longer land, the emptiness in the mirror that once reflected someone you liked. Jung understood the persona as something necessary, a bridge between the self and society. But he also warned against identifying too deeply with it, because once the mask becomes the man, any threat to it feels like death. And when sex disappears, that identity begins to rot. The man no longer receives the same looks. He no longer performs the same rituals. The validation circuit breaks. This is the moment many men panic. They begin clinging to old habits, old conquests, quick fixes, anything to keep the mask alive. But for the conscious man, this collapse is not failure, it is revelation. It shows him just how much of his identity depended on being desired, and in that raw space, he faces a deeper question: who am I when I'm no longer chosen? Once the mask begins to crack, the symptoms arrive suddenly, violently, and without apology. They are not logical, they are not kind, they hit like a withdrawal syndrome, because that is exactly what they are. For many men, sex was never just release, it was regulation, dopamine management, emotional distraction, a way to feel wanted without having to feel vulnerable. When that disappears, the nervous system doesn't adapt calmly, it rebels. Rage comes first. Outbursts, irritability, disproportionate reactions, the sense that the world owes you something and no one is delivering it. But beneath that rage, there is something worse: emptiness. Not the poetic kind, but the cold kind. The days slow down, motivation dries up, nothing feels exciting. It's not exactly depression, but it feels close. It's the moment the mind realizes its favorite drugs, attention, excitement, and approval, aren't coming back. Then come the cravings, not just for sex, but for all the little rituals that surrounded it. The swiping on the phone, the fantasies, the flirting, the performance. These cravings aren't about lust, they're about control. The mind wants to reassert its power, escape the silence, restart the old cycle, feel something, anything, that feels familiar. Carl Jung might have called this the return of the shadow. The darkest, most rejected parts of the psyche begin to emerge, not to torment, but to be integrated. But integration only begins when the man stops chasing his old fix and starts facing the discomfort for what it truly is, a sign that real transformation hasn't begun, but it's coming. When distractions are removed, what remains is not peace, it's exposure. Most men think they're avoiding lust by living without sex, but abstinence doesn't kill lust, it drags it out of the shadows, and once it's no longer expressed, it begins to mutate. It becomes raw, more honest, and far more dangerous. This is where the man meets the inner beast. Not a monster, not a villain, but a part of himself he has spent years trying to control or deny. Lust is not just about desire, it's tied to power, longing, and buried shame. And when it surfaces without a physical outlet, it exposes fractures in a man's sense of identity. Who is he, without conquest, without affirmation, without that small thrill of being wanted? Alongside lust comes fear, not fear of others, but fear of what's rising within, fear of losing control, fear of what abstinence might reveal, fear that without sex, maybe he's nothing. And beneath that fear lies the deepest wound: fractured masculinity. The man realizes that much of what he once called strength was merely a performance, socially rewarded, but hollow. The power he believed he had depended on being seen, not on true sovereignty. This is Jung's shadow, unclaimed power. And to claim it, the man must stop pretending he's made only of strength and virtue. That's where integration begins, not by repressing these impulses, but by naming them, owning them, and refusing to back down. At first, loneliness feels like silence, but over time, it starts to speak. Most men think they can handle being alone. They confuse loneliness with freedom, but when abstinence stretches on and the external affirmations fade, a different kind of loneliness appears, one that has nothing to do with the absence of people, and everything to do with the absence of self. That's when the mirror appears, not the physical one, but the psychological one, the one that reflects all the questions he's avoided for years. What do I truly want? Who am I when no one is watching? Have I built a real life, or have I just been reacting? Without sex, without flirting, without the distractions of ego-driven validation, the real questions finally rise. The man begins to see himself, not as an actor, not as a provider, not as a protector, but as a person, and often, he doesn't like what he sees. Ambition feels hollow, strength feels like a performance, personality like a collage of expectations and survival mechanisms. This isn't failure, it's exposure. Carl Jung wrote that loneliness doesn't come from not having people around, but from being unable to communicate what truly matters. In that silence, the man realizes he hasn't even communicated that to himself. That's the turning point, because only when he faces that raw, unfiltered, uncomfortable reflection can something more authentic begin to take shape. When a man cuts off sex, the silence doesn't just expose weakness, it provokes rebellion. At first, the body shuts down. There's no desire, no fire, but over time, something more ancient stirs. Not an emotional need, but instead a primal force buried beneath years of social polish, discipline, and moral framing. It doesn't ask for permission. It growls. That's when abstinence becomes dangerous, not for others, but for the man himself. Because the self-image he's protected, calm, composed, rational, begins to crack. Hunger returns, but not just for sex, for risk, for danger, for the vertigo of being alive. This isn't regression, it's confrontation. The civilized man meets the buried animal and realizes that for years, he wasn't transcending, he was sedating his instinct. Jung warned that everything unconscious appears as fate. Repressed desire doesn't disappear. It leaks through moods, sabotages relationships, hijacks thoughts, but when faced consciously, it becomes fuel. The inner rebel doesn't want chaos. It wants truth. It wants power, reclaimed from shame, and abstinence, if it is endured, becomes the trial through which the man learns to possess that force without being possessed by it. Not all men survive this phase. The weak relays. The strong transform. The energy never disappeared. It simply stopped chasing what could never satisfy it. What we call sexual energy is just one expression of something deeper. Libido in the Jungian sense. A psychic force, raw vitality. The will to expand, to build, to penetrate reality itself. When a man stops wasting it on the cycle of desire and release, it doesn't vanish. It becomes restless, and that restlessness is sacred. At first, it's unbearable. It wants to go back, to find relief, to numb the burden. But if he resists the fall, something clicks. Possibilities begin to appear in unexpected places. The discipline to finish what he starts. The drive to build something lasting. The courage to choose the hard path over the easy one. That is transmutation. Sex was never the true goal. It was the shortcut. The real goal was intensity, creation, conquest, recognition, transcendence. Sex offered a spark. Purpose offers permanence. And so the energy that once chased bodies begins to fuel structure, projects, training, creation, legacy. Jung wrote, "The heaviest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. A man who fails to redirect his libido ends up living halfway, never completely destroyed, but never fully alive. But the one who learns to direct that fire inward becomes dangerous in the best possible way. He no longer merely abstains. He's building something no orgasm could ever give him. Immortality through impact." When a man stops spending his energy chasing women, something radical happens. He begins to build. Sublimation, in Jungian terms, is not repression. It's refinement. It's the process of channeling basic impulses, sex, anger, hunger, into higher forms. Art, leadership, discipline, vision. The same fire that once consumed him now becomes fuel, but only if he has the spine to hold it. Most men never get that far. They spin in circles, wanting, chasing, releasing, and pleasure becomes their ceiling. But the few who resist that pull, who face temptation without flinching, access another kind of power. Not power over others, but over themselves. That is the foundation of every empire. Not just empires of land or capital, but of character, clarity, and mastery. History doesn't remember men for how much they consumed. It remembers them for what they built. And the blueprint always begins the same way, abstaining from the trivial to pursue the essential. Think of it as turning chaos into a weapon. The impulse that once distracted him now becomes the current behind his strategy. The tension doesn't disappear. It sharpens. It chisels direction into every hour. It makes his decisions cleaner, his instincts faster, his presence heavier. That's why focused men become dangerous. Because the man who learns to sublimate no longer chases pleasure, he commands reality. And when that happens, everything bends toward him, not the other way around. There comes a moment when the storm passes, after the cravings, after the rage, after the shadow work. And what remains is order, but not the kind imposed from the outside. This order is earned, fought for, reclaimed. Discipline in this phase is not just habit or routine. It is sovereignty. It means the man no longer negotiates with his lower nature. He doesn't argue with lust or beg for focus. He simply acts, because his energy is now tied to something higher. Before abstinence, control felt like a burden, a cage. But after walking through the fire, discipline becomes freedom. Not because temptation vanishes, but because it no longer has power. The man sees it for what it is, noise, and noise no longer sets his rhythm. That's the moment when he stops reacting to every impulse. The fire is still there, but now it burns on his own terms. It's no longer reactive, volatile, or at the mercy of his desires. It has structure, it has order, it has direction, and every act of discipline reinforces that identity. Jung said, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order." That's what abstinence reveals. Not just self-control, but the man capable of living without constant stimulation. When he controls himself, he controls his time, his choices, his future. And that control doesn't just transform him, it terrifies everything that once controlled him. Desire never dies. That's the lie most men cling to when they try to kill it. But sovereignty over impulse isn't about hunger, it's about separation. The man who becomes sovereign doesn't stop desiring. He simply refuses to be ruled by what he desires. This is a different kind of power, one that doesn't come from denial, but from clarity. He can look at beauty without blinking. He can feel lust without obeying it, because now he knows the difference between choice and compulsion. Dependency happens when desire becomes God, when a man starts to believe that without her, without the thrill, the contact, the ecstasy, he is empty. But abstinence reveals a deeper truth. He isn't empty, he is distracted. Beneath the noise of longing, there is a will waiting to be tested, and now it's in control. The sovereign man isn't ashamed of his sexual appetite. He studies, he knows what triggers it, what distorts it, and when to let it speak. But he does not bow to it. That is the real shift. Not abstinence as martyrdom, but abstinence as mastery, a silent contract with himself that says, "I desire, but I wait. I feel, but I choose." Carl Jung called it individuation. The moment a man is no longer possessed by his desires, but possesses himself. This is that moment. Desire is still alive, but he is no longer its servant. There is a difference between a man who seeks attention and one who draws it. One projects outward, performing to be validated. The other says nothing, and yet everything around him begins to shift. That is masculine magnetism, and it is built in silence. When a man lets go of constant sexual pursuit, something curious happens. He becomes still, but not passive. His energy no longer leaks. It consolidates. It densifies. He stops chasing, and in that absence of need, presence emerges. Women feel it before he speaks, because what they perceive isn't charm, it's containment. Most men try to attract through actions, words, status, gestures. But the sovereign man doesn't project. He radiates. His containment isn't repression, it's selection. He could move, but he doesn't. He could speak, but he waits. That tension, that control, is exactly what draws others in. It's a kind of strength that cannot be faked. It only appears after the need for applause, affection, and approval has been burned away. It's not that he doesn't desire connection. He simply doesn't need it to feel whole. That distinction changes everything. Carl Jung spoke of the anima and animus, the unconscious feminine in the man, the masculine in the woman. When a man withdraws from compulsive sexual desires, his polarity intensifies. He no longer overextends, he grounds. And in doing so, he draws everything toward him. That is the kind of attraction a woman cannot explain. Not because he tries, but because he does. Self-governance begins when a man stops externalizing the control of his time, his body, his mind. There are no more compulsive impulses steering his decisions. They spend their lives circling around it, ruled by longings, distractions, and roles they inherited, without question. They confuse control with conquest. But to rule the world, a man must first rule himself. The throne isn't about dominating others, it's about inner authority. It's when a man's mind no longer interrupts him, when emotion no longer hijacks his decisions, when he's no longer at war with his instincts, but not enslaved by them either. Here there is silence. Not numbness, not boredom, stillness. And from that stillness comes a different kind of clarity. Not the clarity of answers, but of direction. He knows who he is, where he stands, and what he serves. Jung would call this the integration of the self, the union of shadow, ego, and spirit. It doesn't make the man perfect, it makes him whole. The man on his inner throne doesn't react, he decides. He doesn't seek control, he embodies it. He is no longer the boy seeking permission, he is the man who grants it to himself. And from that point on, everything he does comes from his center. Jung never advocated permanent abstinence for everyone. Rather, he saw conscious periods of withdrawal as essential to psychological development. Like a musician who must master silence to truly understand sound. The goal isn't to eliminate sexuality from your life forever, it's to develop a conscious relationship with it. To choose when, how, and with whom to express this energy, instead of being driven by unconscious compulsion. When you eventually return to physical intimacy after a conscious period of abstinence, Jung observed that the experience is qualitatively different. It becomes an expression of awareness, instead of an escape from it. It becomes connection, instead of consumption. Creation, instead of depletion. Jung understood something our culture has forgotten, that our relationship with sexual energy is our relationship with life force itself. When we direct that energy consciously, we don't diminish, we discover ourselves. The title of this video suggests that when the body goes quiet, the soul speaks. Jung would say, it's not that the soul was ever silent, it's that we couldn't hear it over the noise of unconscious desire. Conscious and temporary abstinence creates the inner stillness necessary to hear your deepest voice, the one that knows your true purpose, your authentic desires, your real power. And that can only happen when abstinence is chosen, not imposed by shame or fear. As Jung wrote, your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awaken. The question isn't whether you should practice abstinence, it's whether you're ready to discover what emerges when you stop running from yourself and start running toward who you're meant to become. If this exploration of Jung's insights resonated with you, consider what areas of your life could benefit from conscious containment and the redirection of energy. Remember, this isn't about deprivation, it's about transformation. Amen.